This is part 2 of building the app's header section. So to start this lecture, let's actually put these 3 elements that we have here in the header side by side. And how do we do that? Well, you guessed it, we're going to use Flexbox. So what should be the Flex container here in this case? Well, it should simply be the parent element of the elements that we want side by side. And that's these 3 here. So the logo, the search bar, and the user navigation, right? And so the parent of these is the header element. So here we go. Yeah, so in the header. So all we have to do is to set display to flex, and that will put them side by side. All right, now let's give them actually some background color so that we can see what's going on here. So the search, I'm going to use my orange red favorite here again. And then on this one here, we can use like green, yellow. All right, check it out. So, here we go. Now, how do we want these to be aligned? We want this green one here, so the user navigation, all the way to the right side, right? And then this one here in the middle. And what is the Flexbox property that allows us to do that? I hope that you printed your cheat sheet so that you can take a look at it and find out which property we have to use, okay? And in case you don't know, we need to use justify content. And of course, that one is again on the Flex container, not on the Flex items, okay? So justify content will align the elements along the main axis. And that's the one we're talking about here, right? So what are the possible values here? For example, we could use center, just to show it to you. And that's what that would do. So it would simply center all of these elements side by side here in the center of the Flex container. But that's also not what we want, because what we really want is space between. Okay, and so it will basically divide the empty space between these 3 elements. And that's what that looks like, and it's perfect. That's exactly what we want. We could also do like space around. Let me show that to you as well. It would result in this one, but that puts way too much space here on the left side of this one and here on the right side. So we don't want that. We only want a little space, and so we're going to do that later with margins. But for now, in here, let's do space between. And I think that this one is actually the most useful one of all. All right. So that is alignment along the main axis, so from left to right. But we also want to align these items along the cross axis, right? So basically here from top to bottom, so that, for example, we can have this image here nicely centered vertically in the header. So if we didn't have Flexbox, we could now use like margin top and would then have to experiment which is the perfect margin. But Flexbox makes our lives so much easier, and all we have to do is to use the align items property, right? So remember that one? So align items and simply set it to center. And that's what it will produce. So this one is now nicely centered vertically, so along the cross axis, and so is this one and this one. This one is of course overlapping it because there's too much content in it, but still it is now centered. So you saw that before it was set to stretch, and that's why this element here was occupying the entire space, so everything here was orange, right? But now we set it to center, and so it's vertically centered now. So that is align items. So all we have to really do now is to just format these elements here, okay? So let's start with our logo and simply give it some margin to the left side of 3 rem, okay? And so now that's perfect, so really nicely positioned here. So starting here with the search element, let's first give it some width, okay? And since it's a flex item, let's do that using the flex property. So flex, we don't want it to grow to fill all its available space, okay? We also don't want it to shrink, and we want it to occupy 40% of the header, okay? Now as for the input element, this is how we want it to look like, okay? So it's this gray rounded element here with this gray icon here at the end, okay? So let's now do that. And so we start with the font family, which on an input element doesn't inherit the font family of the global document. And so we have to automatically set it to inherit here. And the same thing for the font size, actually. So let's set it to inherit here as well. And then we want the background color. And again, we're going to use our variables here. And the one that we want right now is this gray color here. Okay, so light gray 2. We want it to have no border. We also want the text color to be inherited. Okay, so we set all of these here in the same place. Well, what else can we do? We can set some padding. So 0.7 rem on the top and bottom, and 2 rem on the left and on the right side. So 20 pixels. Now we also can set that border radius to a really high number. Doesn't matter. Can even set it in pixels, it doesn't really matter, just a high number so that it has these rounded edges. And okay, let's take a look actually. And that's what it looks like. Well, still not perfect, but we're kind of getting there. We have to actually give it a width here, okay? And we're not doing 100% because we want this to happen when we click it. You saw that? So it expanded when it received the focus, and when we click outside, it goes back to the original size. So let's set it to like 90%. Okay, and then we can also change what we want to happen when we focus the element. So focus, we don't want that outline, okay, but instead what we want to happen is that the width should be set to 100%. So that was the effect that we saw earlier. So when the input element becomes focused, it increases from 90% to 100% of its available width, which is this 40% here of the parent element. And we also want it to become a little bit darker, which is basically the same thing as this, but the light number 3. So that's a bit darker. And for the animation here, transition all in 0.2 seconds. So let's take a look at that now. And that's much better. So when we click it, it increases to 100%. Great. Well, it's still not perfect, but for now, let's continue with styling this button here now, okay? So here we are, the button. So first, we don't want any border on it. And then we want it to have the same background color as the input, because we basically want it to be like on top of the input, right? And actually, in order for that to happen, we should give the input here some negative margin on the right side. So margin right, and then like minus 3.5 rem. And so this way, the button will move on top of the input. Okay, now let's also just remove the focus here from this one. So outline none, but what happens instead is that basically when we click the button, we just want it to move a bit down. So transform, translate Y, and then let's just say 2 pixels. All right, let's take a look now. And that's much better. So now it's actually on top of the search bar. And when we click this, we see this nice animation going on. Now what's left to do here is to actually center this icon here vertically as well as horizontally, right? Because when the input field is not active, we want it to be at the center of this element here, right? So of the parent element. So how do we do that? Well, the best solution is once again to use Flexbox. And so you see each time we want to center something or to align something, we can always use Flexbox. So Flexbox is perfect for all of these small situations where we need to align or center some elements. So what should actually be the flex container of these elements? Well, of course, it's the search element, right? And so now, for the first time, we're doing something that we didn't do before, which is that a flex item is becoming a flex container. And that is perfectly possible. So we now have nested Flexbox. Okay? So again, let's take a look. And it's already centered, you see, because align items is set to stretch. So align items, let's move it from stretch to center, and then justify content also to center. So again, align items to center centers the elements along the cross axis, and justify content center centers the elements along the main axis. So let's check that out. And yep, that is exactly what we wanted, right? So now I hit this, and now it grows to the sides. So that's perfect. Now this margin here is not perfect here actually, but that's because of the negative margin that I gave it here on the other side, which is actually a bit too much. So it was here. And actually another thing that we have to do is to set the background color of the button to the same color of this focused here when the input is focused, right? So right now if you look closely, you will see that if the input is selected, the background color here of this icon is slightly lighter, okay? So let's fix that. And we have to actually do it outside here. So input, focus, and then select the adjacent search button, right? So we did that a lot of time in the other project. So just to remember, here we have the input and here we have the button, and they are siblings, okay? And so therefore we can use the adjacent selector to select the sibling of the selected input, okay? So here in the components, and now what we want to happen is that the button becomes the same background color as the input, okay? And so now it should be perfect. All right, now one last thing is the color of this magnifying glass. Remember that I told you that with the way that we included the SVG sprite in the HTML, we could change the SVG color right in CSS, right? So let me now show you how we can do that. And it's actually very easy. All we have to do is to use the fill property. So fill, and that's it. And now we can specify our color. And the one that I want is this dark gray here, the number 3. And that's actually it. Let's just remove here this background color. And then this component will be completely ready. Okay, let's just compare it to this one. Well, this is actually a bit different because the text is bigger here and lighter. And so we should change that as well. So basically the placeholder here has a lighter text. Then when we start typing, it becomes the dark text that we have in our example, right? So what we have to do here is to change the placeholder text. So let's do that. So input, and then remember what we want is the WebKit input placeholder pseudo element. So WebKit input placeholder, meaning that this only works in WebKit right now, which are the Chrome and Safari browsers. So we want a font weight of 100 only and a color of a light gray 4. Okay, and now just remember that we put the font size here to inherit. And so it inherits the global font size, which is 10 pixels, remember, so 1 rem. But that's quite small actually. And so let's set a default font size here on the header. Okay, so let's go to the header and set a font size here. And then it will inherit the font size from this parent component. So let's set it to 14 pixels here, so 1.4 rem, and then check it out again. And yeah, that's much better. Now that looks a lot like our original, right? So this one here. So that was some great progress. You used a lot more Flexbox in this lecture to align these smaller elements here in this component, and also overall in this header here, right? So Flexbox is perfect for these small kind of situations where you have to do some simple alignments. So instead of messing with margins and translates and floats and text align center and all of that stuff, we just use Flexbox and it's perfect for that. Now next up, we need to fix this user navigation here, of course, but I'm leaving that to the next lecture so that you can take a break right now and then come back to the next lecture once you're ready to go.